Bob, I would love to believe in God, and one of the issues that you have to wrestle with if you want to believe in God is how can God interact with the world? It sounds to many people superficial, but when you begin thinking about the science, it gets very complicated. How do we even begin to address this question?
Well, I think you're right to say it's a key issue. I mean, the Bible makes no sense without God acting in the world. So what do? It seems as if contemporary science coming out of Newton gives you a closed mechanistic view of the world, that everything happens with causal closure, that every event is the effect of a previous cause, that you've got a mechanistic view of nature, and so how could God act without suspending the laws of nature, violating natural processes, and so on?
The ultimate tinkerer.
Exactly.
And God has to be in there tinkering and moving the atoms around and doing stuff.
But doing it by intervening, right? That God intervenes in nature.
Right.
So that sort of divides Christians. Conservatives tend to agree with that because they want to rescue the tradition of God acting. Whereas liberals since 1830 and so have said, well, our language about divine action is a kind of subjective appreciation of what's otherwise a natural process, kind of like the eclipse, where I say it's beautiful, I'm astonished, but nothing unnatural happened. I mean, God didn't do a special event there. Interestingly, the conversation has taken a turn because, of course, in 20th century science, there's new possibilities for nature not being a closed mechanism as we thought from Newton, but possibly much more open and flexible both to human agency and divine agency. So what are the potentials there? Well, one is top-down, whole-part causality, sort of on the mind-brain analogy, that you can argue that there's an emergent phenomenon like mind that has some effect on brain, and maybe that's analogous to God's action. Or maybe God acts on the universe as a whole, a view that Arthur Peacock explored, that somehow, without getting into the details of the universe, God still can affect the universe as a whole, and therefore the parts.
Which would mean that because God is the creator, certainly the sustainer of the universe at all points in time,
right,
that God doesn't have to deal with all the individual atoms and subatomic particles, but just God can sort of will the whole thing to happen in the way he wants.
In the way he wants, John Polkinghorne has explored chaos theory, where the butterfly effect and so on suggests that small initial changes in a system has long-term consequences, right? The butterfly is flittering over.
Causes a hurricane in Brazil.
Got it. Nancy Murphy, Tom Tracy, George Ellis, and myself and others have explored quantum mechanics as an area where, at the foundational level of science, physics, one might say there is openness in nature, and that there are events that happen for which there is no sufficient natural cause. Now, that's an interpretation of quantum mechanics. It may be wrong. There may be deterministic interpretations which win the day. But until we really know which interpretation is correct, you can at least play a what-if game. What if this sort of Copenhagen interpretation were the correct one? What would it say about divine action? And it seems to me pretty straightforward that you can have an account of God's actually acting or objectively acting in nature without intervening. So it's a non-interventionist objective divine action.
So you have God acting in the world, but not in a tinkering interventionist sense.
Right, exactly. I mean, the idea is that God creates a world ex nihilo, out of nothing, with openness sort of at every level, particularly at the quantum mechanical level, to divine action. So God isn't forcing God's self into an otherwise self-sufficient world, but that the world really depends upon God. At the same time, the result are the regularities that quantum mechanics talks about. The regularities which undermine the periodic table, properties of matter, and so on. It isn't as if it's a very subtle point. God's making a difference that in most cases makes no difference. Okay, because God produces the world we take for granted, right? The world of hardness and temperature and coolness of metal, which are all ultimately quantum mechanical phenomena. So God produces the regularities of the world in an ongoing way, by at the same time acting in the world in a constant way.
So the regularities are occurring, but there are these little places that are potentially open in a way?
Well, in this view, it's open everywhere at the quantum level. Wherever a measurement takes place, wherever an interaction between a particle and a larger molecule takes place, that's a place in which God is acting. Now, remember, the fundamental way God acts is to create and sustain the world. This is assumed. There wouldn't be a world without God. But
And it's a continuing process. It's not just a one-time thing.
Exactly.
It's just sustaining every force, every element, every subatomic part, everything.
Right. That's a given.
Okay.
But then within that, it's the world such that it actually is also open, at least in quantum mechanics and perhaps elsewhere, like the mind-brain problem or whatever else, to divine action. Now, the nice thing about that, it allows us to see an account that gets beyond the dilemma we were in with classical physics. That is, allows us to retrieve the biblical tradition of God acting in nature in a way which is compassionate and full of integrity and cares for and preserves the world without breaking into the world.
I love the phrase that I've read, causal joint. Mm-hmm. The joint where God has a cause in the world to do things seemingly different than what the regularity would admit. Is that correct?
Well, it's a loaded term. Some people see it as helpful in this conversation. Some people see it as trying to make God into a secondary cause, into a natural cause, because the joint is between two bones. So God is like the world. Yeah. I don't want to make God into a natural cause or a secondary cause. But it is the domain where the acts of God show up. It's sort of one step removed from a joint. It's in these quantum mechanical events where God is acting, all we see is quantum mechanics. All we see are, particles decaying or something. We don't see God's presence in the world. But nevertheless, God is making a difference.
I find it fascinating that in all the theological ways that, from a scientific point of view, to look at God's action in the world, there's such a vast orders of magnitude scale differences.
Absolutely.
When you mentioned Arthur Peacock's idea of the whole universe as a whole, God is sustainer, and then at the opposite extreme, you're in quantum mechanics, and maybe in between is John Polkinghorne in chaos theory, which is more of a macroscopic or emergent. So you have everybody who sort of believes the same, but no one has any idea how God is acting in the world.
Well, that's for sure. They're all just sort of attempts to put some language around this astonishing mystery that we believe that God is acting, whether or not we can talk about it. But let me just say, there's been an interesting sort of coming together. Arthur's gone now, but in his last book, we all wrote responses to Arthur's work. And I think that's where I really tried my best to say to Arthur the problem with his point of view from my point of view. And that is, he sees the analogy of the boundary of a system affecting the system, like the shape of the pot affects the kind of structure of the water as it boils. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, God affects the universe as a whole, the boundary of the universe, to achieve its states. God isn't the boundary in some simple way, but God affects the boundary. The problem is that in general relativity, the universe has no boundary. It's a boundaryless view. So there's no boundary or containing shape. The universe is its own shape. It's like a beach ball. You can walk forever and you never fall off it. So in fact, there's no way to really imagine the boundary of the universe that God affects. In fact, it's more like you said, that by affecting the boundary, God is affecting every microscopic event in the universe. Right. So interestingly, as I wrote in this last piece, I said, even though Arthur never liked the quantum mechanical approach, it's as if his insistence on God acting on the whole, when the whole has no boundary, leads him to God acting on every part. And so we sort of come together around that.
And that sort of does make sense, certainly if you believe God more as in the sustainer of the universe on a continuing basis, continuous creation.
Exactly.
Then it becomes more of a natural thing.
Yes.
But how do miracles fit into this? Because a miracle is a disruption of the natural process.
Right. Classically, a miracle is a manifestation of extraordinary potential in nature. It's not a disruption of processes. But with Hume and Enlightenment, it becomes that. Hume set the stage by defining miracles as a violation of natural law. So let me just say, this is not that. This is God acting in, with, and through the laws, if you like, because God creates a universe in which there's openness. Hume didn't have that as a possibility, so it didn't occur to him. So it's less than a miracle. It's not breaking a law. It's the laws allow for divine action without being broken. Mm. But on the other hand, I'm not saying miracles couldn't occur. I'm just saying we've been able to cleave apart two different conceptions of God's action. A subjectivist account where we're just saying beauty is in the eyes of the beholder, and an objectivist account which is miraculous. And now we're saying you can have a new kind of objectivist account that's non-miraculous or less than miracle. It involves real acts of God without not only violating laws of nature, but because of the laws of nature, which are reflections of God's action anyway.
And this would be the same for the normal activities that we have, and then what we would traditionally call miracles, the sun standing still, the Red Sea.
Well, then that gets into another question, which is theologically, what kind of miracles should we be committed to? Is the sun setting still of the same order of magnitude as the Torah being given to Moses? I'd say no. I mean, how would you imagine Judaism without the Torah? How would you imagine Christianity without incarnation? Those are what I call mega miracles, or more than a miracle. I mean, actually there I see God as changing the laws of nature into revelations of a new creation. So I don't tend to use the category of miracles for those. So part of our homework theologically is to be really careful on whether or not we're committed to every single sort of miraculous thing in the Bible or not. So I'm saying philosophically, I'm not going to rule them out. But the NIOTA, the non-interventionist objective divine action, is about something less than a miracle. It's about how God acts in evolution. If I'm a theistic evolutionist, opposed to intelligent design and opposed to atheism, can I deliver on saying God actually acts in evolution? I'm saying yes. Every single genetic mutation has a quantum mechanical process involved in it. And therefore, in some sense, it's open ground for God's acting in the world. But the result isn't a change in the course of nature. The result is the course of nature. What you see is what you get. So I see the history of life on earth as God acting with and through nature. The atheist sees the history of life with God as nature on its own. Where is God?